Ignore me while I have an IT fail to begin with. Let's go to slideshow. Okay. So I want to share two. Fingers crossed.
Yep, that's all showing nicely, Colin.
Excellent. Okay. So perhaps I ought to just introduce myself to start with. My name's Colin Waldock. I'm one of the lecturers at the School of Pharmacy. Must seem a bit odd having a physiotherapist by background, lecturing at the School of Pharmacy and doing a PhD in pharmacy, which I think is the official title of my PhD. So my background is a musculoskeletal physiotherapist, and I teach primarily on the postgrad non-medical prescribing programs that we run, and clinical consultation and diagnostics. So this morning, I want to share with you some early outcomes of my project that essentially has sought to understand what happens to physiotherapists when they undertake prescribing programs. In essence, how do they change? Now, for some of you, some of these terminology may be coming from another planet. So I just wanted to make them clear. Non-medical prescribing is essentially prescribing of medicines by anyone other than a doctor or a dentist. And within that, there are two types of non-medical prescribing. So you have supplementary prescribing, where there's a shared tripartite agreement between, and the independent prescriber has to be a doctor or a dentist in this case. There's the non-medical prescriber, and there's the agreement of the patient. So it's patient specific. It's not a generic administration of medicines as in patient group directives. So it's real prescribing, but it is there's a shared responsibility there between an overseeing prescriber, as in the doctor or the dentist, and the supplementary prescriber. And then there's independent prescribing, where all the responsibility and the accountability is held by that prescriber, and that prescriber can essentially be a non-medical prescriber. Nurses can prescribe and pharmacists can prescribe from any drug in the BNF, apart from some drugs such as diamorphine, and they can be they certainly can be prescribed under special conditions. Some professional groups can only prescribe as a supplementary prescriber. In the case of physiotherapy, we can prescribe 7 controlled drugs as an IP, but it's a bit ridiculous because we can't prescribe codeine because it's not on the list. So if I wanted to prescribe someone 15 milligrams of codeine, I would have to use a supplementary prescribing model. But hey, according to the list, I could actually just prescribe fentanyl instead, which is 10 times more dangerous and 10 times, and more than 10 times as strong, which just goes to show the silliness sometimes of these things. And thought leaders, which is a term I'm using in the study, and these essentially were people such as people at the forefront of non-medical prescribing, people either employed or recently employed by NHS England, university lecturers, and non-medical prescribing leads. So some background here. Physios have been able to train as prescribers of medication since 2006 as initially supplementary prescribers. And I was actually one of the first. I did my training in 2006. To give you some idea, it was on cohort 4 here at the Medway School of Pharmacy, and we're now up to cohort 59 starting in a couple of weeks' time. In 2013, via government legislation, the final piece of the puzzle came into place and we were able to convert that training to independent. It crossed 2012 to 13, which is why the slide says 2012, but the actual action of that was the year after. But despite that, there's only about 3% of physiotherapists who are currently prescribers. And since I joined the school back in 2016, that's been sort of itching at the back of my head, and I wanted to understand why that might be the case. And when I first of all started in this journey, the literature review showed a gap in the understanding of what it means to be a physiotherapist. As a profession, we really haven't been that introspective, and we haven't figured out exactly who and what we are and how that changes when we take on new skills. So we have a poor understanding of what the role identity is. And that's something that I sought to define prior to showing how role identities changed by undertaking prescribing medication. So as a consequence, the aims of the project can be clarified as follows. The initial aim is to explore what the role identity for physiotherapy is. And this was completed from a range of perspectives in order to add reliability to the project. I then explored what happens when physiotherapists undertake prescribing. And again, this was investigated from a range of perspectives. And finally, I aimed to examine this impact by focusing on the impact that physiotherapy has on role identity on the areas highlighted within the box on this slide. So we're looking at impact on patient care, impact on physiotherapist pre-registration education, and on the scope of practice. So the research question consists of both exploratory and examination parts. And that is suited really to a mixed methods approach. So I'm going to be using an exploratory sequential model, and that model is based on models of mixed methods put forward by Cresswell and Plano-Clark, who are one of the leaders in mixed methods research. So as you see in the slide, the initial qualitative phase is followed by a quantitative phase in which the findings really of the qualitative part are going to be tested, i.e. the theory or the conceptual framework that I developed. Because of the way the research is set up and the background methodology, we have 3 phases. So the first phase was around theory generation, and that included interviews with these range of perspectives, and those perspectives were thought leaders and influencers, these non-medical prescribing leads, course leads, NHS England employees, members of the public. We didn't go for active patients because that would have required NHS ethics, but by obtaining perceptions from members of the public, I could restrict myself to university ethics, which was smoother and quicker, and physiotherapists as well, both prescribers and non-prescribers. So the physiotherapists were a mix, as I said, and they ranged in experience from 18 months post-qualification. The longest was 42 years post-qualification, and when you were looking at the median of that time and the mode for that time, the median was skewed somewhat by that last figure. If we excluded that, then the median figure for qualification was some 19 years. On completion of the interviews and the analysis of those interviews, Questionnaire was developed in order to test that developed theory with a wider audience of physiotherapists in the United Kingdom. And that part of the study is reflected in phase 2 and phase 3. So in summary, therefore, the research design is reflected here with the use of a topic guide to inform semi-structured interviews to collect the qualitative data. And that was used to develop a theory of role identity change. And that provided the data informing the development of a questionnaire essentially to test that theory. So we are using interviews to develop the perceptions and viewpoints from a range of individuals and perspectives. I've analysed the qualitative data to develop codes and focus codes and categories and an overarching conceptual framework, and then it's testing that conceptual framework, and we're using the themes as developing the questions for the questionnaire. So obviously phase 1 interviews initially planned to be carried out with face-to-face interviews. Starter data collection would have been about March 2020, and then something else happened, coincided with the outbreak of a well-known global pandemic. It's affected everyone. I was quite lucky in the sense that I was able to continue my data collection throughout really the lockdown via the use of virtual technology when we all became experts in Zoom and Teams. Few people wanted telephone interviews, and to do that I recorded those interviews on a dictaphone to allow for accurate transcription by verbatim, but most of them assented to video recording, which also enabled me to review the non-verbal interactions as well, the silences, the pauses, the facial expressions. So in all, I interviewed 9 thought leaders and influencers. 2 of those I interviewed twice, so there was a total of 11 interviews, 22 members of the public and 18 physiotherapists, predominantly using purposive sampling. I chose constructivist grounded theory as my method of choice for a number of reasons. Mixed methods shares with grounded theory a basis in a pragmatic philosophy which has its origins in the Chicago school back in the 1920s and 30s. Sharma's version of grounded theory respects that social constructs such as role identity are impacted by both researcher and participant, especially given my own context as a physiotherapist and an independent prescriber. So grounded theory itself sets out to explicitly develop a theory of what's happening and not just looking for underlying themes. And that theory is grounded in the collected data, subjected to a constant comparison of the data as it is collected. So the analysis occurs during the process, and the topic guide can be subtly changed during the process and as you undertake further interviews. As your coding comes to the fore, then there are areas that look promising, and you can dig into those and see whether they're just promising or whether they're coming to anything. So you're constantly evaluating your interpretation of the data as each successive interview is completed. Phase 2, so on completion of the data analysis of those interviews and development of a theory or conceptual framework, which I will be showing you a picture of later. Work began on the development of a questionnaire. That was subjected to 2 aspects of peer review to increase the validity of the tool and its reliability. So first of all, I created an expert panel consisting of individuals both inside the university and outside who had specific experience in questionnaire design in the area of non-medical prescribing. And on receipt of comments by the expert panel, the draft questionnaire was revised appropriately and then assessed by use of cognitive interviews with a random sample from the physiotherapist that had been involved in the phase 1 interviews. To further address internal reliability of the questionnaire, advice was also sought from a statistician within the university who reviewed the steps undertaken and has given further advice as to regard statistical tests to look at reliability and validity of the tool. And we'll talk about those in a slide towards the end. And then finally, phase 3. So phase 3 is open, and that was started once the cognitive interviews had been completed and any revisions required addressed. The plan being to share the final questionnaire with the UK physiotherapy profession as a whole. All 60,000 people were registered with the CSP at the moment via forums hosted by the Chartered Society of Physiotherapy and social media forums available to myself, namely Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. Yes, I even added an Instagram account. Not that I have any followers, I don't think. The data from the questionnaire will be totally quantitative, allowing for the use of descriptive and inferential statistics to be used to determine the value of the developed theory to a wider population, looking perhaps beyond physiotherapy, if all goes well, to the professions looking to become prescribers, such as occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, and to other professions who are already prescribers. So at this point, I'd like to share with you some examples of results that have been obtained from phase 1 of the trial, which is now complete. So my apologies for the rather small looking font, but these are there just for demonstration purposes, really. So I used NVivo to analyze and make sense of qualitative data. And this slide is just an example of what NVivo looks like. Hopefully you can see here in the 3 columns key aspects. On the left is highlighted by, I'm not even sure whether there is a red arrow on this. Might have to try, and no, there isn't. So I'm just going to go back. Previous, right. So on the left you have which interview you're talking about. The middle column is the transcript of that interview, and on the right hand side, this is where the coding is being developed. And you will see here coding examples such as changing practice, career choice, influencing factors, representing physiotherapy, developing trust, prescribing by junior staff, etc. So, as I mentioned previously, I completed 11 interviews for thought leaders, 22 interviews for the public, and 18 for physiotherapists. And the analysis developed from initial coding to focus coding, codes that became more theoretical in nature, covering a number of initial codes. And those focused codes in turn inform the categories to the right-hand side of the slide. These are the key concepts that directly inform the developed theory. And apart from coding, which is where the analyst provides a word or phrase to log a segment of text, a key aspect of qualitative analysis is memoing. And this was carried out for coding that looks promising from a theory generating perspective. And we'll talk about memoing and illustrate them in a few slides' time. But I just wanted to share with you, when organizing coding, NVivo allows you to create code books. So this is an excerpt from the initial code book with thought leaders and their influences. And the next 2 slides will show the additional complexity. If you can read the font, there's absolutely nothing wrong with your eyes, and I wish I had them because it gets increasingly smaller. I'm not expecting you to read it. It's just there to show the increased codes and the complexity. So this was the code book as it looked at the end of thought leaders' influences and the public. And this was the code book as it looked at the end of all of the interviews with members of the public and physiotherapists and thought leaders. So memoing, and perhaps this is one of the most important things that one does when undertaking qualitative research. First, they act as a means of providing evidence of why the code was chosen, encouraging reflexivity on the part of the researcher, asking them to consider the influences on their choice of wording for the code. Secondly, it links to where the code fits to developing theory, and as such can be valuable when it comes to making a cogent argument to support the theory. And in this slide, you can see a range of questions used to interrogate each memo created. And this is an example of part of the memo. This one I've chosen relates to the development of a professional identity, a code that sits at the very heart of the theory I was attempting to show. And you can see here how each aspect of the memo is unpacked and shows development within coding as shown in the second row, where I've demonstrated how I changed the name. So I initially called this code Issues of Professional Identity, and then taking on board information that I'd read from both Saldana's book on coding and Kathy Sharma's in her book on the constructive grounded theory method. They both spoke about using gerunds, i.e. active verbs, to show a process. And so the coding names were changed, and it's important that that's included in these reflexive memos. So these are the questions that I addressed each memo to. So how did I personally relate to the phenomena under investigation? What did it mean to me? Why did I choose the name of the code? What does the name actually mean? What does it say about physiotherapy? What makes this code a valid coding statement? And what other codes does this relate to? So this is where you start to develop the interaction between different codes and how they form together to form focus codes and categories. And finally, how this is related to emerging theory. So each code is subjected to this very specific reflexive analysis. So I wanted to draw your attention to this particular memo due to reflection which led to a discussion within my supervisory team around safeguarding of participants. The participant has shared a story of where she'd been subject to inappropriate behaviour by a physiotherapist historically. And that led to the development of a management group, which would be able to review scenarios such as this. Thankfully, this particular individual confirmed that they were not suffering from any long-term effects. However, they reported that they were grateful that we had added an extra safeguarding element to the project subsequently. For me, this was a potent reminder of the potential for unexpected findings that can be uncovered when undertaking interviews as part of data collection in research projects. The care that needs to be taken to research participants, and the power relationship that exists between clinicians and their patients. And that led me to think about the power relationship between myself as a researcher and the participants in my study, and hence the vital importance of both physiotherapists and researchers in not abusing that power. So I've just been discussing methods of analysis, and this is our chance to look at some of those early results which leading to the formation of a conceptual framework or theory as to role identity for physiotherapy, and importantly, role identity change in the presence of prescribing medication. So 5 key areas or focus codes shown here on this slide. They're determined by reviewing the initial codes and looking for areas of interrelationship and meaning between those initial codes. And over the next 5 slides, I will show examples of the data from quotes gained from those interviews. So here you have a range of opinions, and they are just a selection of the data that fed into this code of developing professional identity. I hope you can clearly see a sense of movement and growth within the profession, with reference to a need for change in pre-registration education. The fact that pre-registration education for physiotherapists contains very, very little, if any, pharmacology. A blurring of professional roles, increasing liaison with other professional groups, and added skills such as monitoring bloods and requesting imaging. With regards to responding to needs, there's elements of frustration that the Committee for Human Medicines they're reported to have less knowledge of allied health professionals, of which physiotherapy is a part, than they do of nurses and pharmacists. The value of physiotherapy as a prime leader in the provision of healthcare, the difficulty in accessing GPs, and the importance of not being professionally siloed. And the term silo was used on many occasions in the interviews with thought leaders and influencers, where people are looking at professional groups and the requirements and the needs when we're looking for improving patient care, to break down some of those professional silos that exist. So the concerns highlighted on the previous slide about the CHM gain traction in the code coping with frustration, where there's considerable irritation at the inability of physiotherapists to prescribe independently from the whole of the BNF, like their nursing and pharmacist colleagues. And that may be part of the issue why there's still a lag in people coming forward. There remains some resistance from both outside of the profession, as highlighted by the concerns that are experienced by some physios reporting negative feedback from medics, and from within the profession, where those undertaking programs of study to become prescribers find it difficult to access placements with physiotherapist prescribers, with a hint that there are elements of a protectionist mentality at work in some quarters. These last three slides feed into the category of an evolving professional identity, one of two categories that underpins a theory of role identity change in the conceptual model, which we'll have a look at in a moment. So these next two slides talk about imaging physiotherapy, and this one is from the inside perspective, the physiotherapy perspective. In other words, this is what we think that we are as physiotherapists. Obviously, the contextual element of this study is clear from the quote, "We are all white middle-class females." Elsewhere, you can see influences of sport and a classic Chartered Society of Physiotherapy uniform in the UK, that of navy blue trousers and a white polo shirt. The quote that we are physical therapists has a double-edged connotation, of course, and also feeds into the concerns that some of those within the profession hold about prescribing and whether it is good for the profession or not. And that's echoed to a part in the quote that explicitly states that it is like treating patients with physical measures without any prescription. And it's interesting, I think, to compare those ideas to those that emanate from outside of the profession. Some are quite negative. It's not something that I have a lot of faith in. To one representative for the Department of Health stating that they are at the forefront of health provision. The view from outside of the profession is quite heterogeneous, with most strongly equating physiotherapists to physical treatments, offering perceptions relating to physical procedures. Oddly, in responses to questions about prescribing, members of the public were overall very supportive on physiotherapists prescribing medications. There were a few that were quite negative, but these were contextual. For example, the quote about bodywork came from someone who was living in Germany, where physiotherapists very much focus on physical measures and there is no non-medical prescribing available. And so it comes to the conceptual model. Hopefully you can see here how the 5 key areas fit within the overall conceptual framework for professional role identity, and how that identity evolves due to development in professional role and the flux within the system provoked by need for change and frustrations from both inside and outside of the profession. Pressures of change on how we see ourselves, then have a dynamic interplay with how physiotherapy is imaged, again from inside and outside of the profession, feeding into a sense of current identity. So the questionnaire, as is developed using Qualtrics, and here you can see the opening page as it would be viewed by a participant, including at the bottom of the image the option of confirming their consent to proceed. So what happens is when a participant would click on here, that link takes them automatically to the participant information leaflet that's stored on my research website. Once they click that they've read the information leaflet, then they go forward to see whether they want happy to proceed or not. The design of the questionnaire is such that there's an initial combined set of questions which principally focus on participant demographics. There's a logic step right at the beginning. Have you been part of the study before? And if they have, then they go straight to the end with a thank you message. So the people who are to fill this questionnaire are primarily those people who are naive to the study. And then they will go down one of 4 pathways. So you'll either have a prescribing physiotherapist, a physiotherapist student prescriber, so someone who's on a non-medical prescribing program, a physiotherapist, and a student physiotherapist. Those 4 pathways have identical questions apart from an extra set belonging to the prescribing physiotherapist, where they talk about any issues they've encountered after qualification. And then they all come together for an end of survey question asking about length of qualification. So the types of analysis that I shall be using, for content reliability, I'll be using Cronbach's Alpha, and for the research tool validity of the questionnaire, we'll be looking at factor analysis. From the demographic data within groups, I'll be using mostly descriptive statistics, and we have 4 groups that are essentially unlike each other, and I'll be using the Cross-Skull-Wallis test, which is non-parametric analysis, looking for differences between groups. So where are we at now? Phase 3 of the questionnaire is live. So if you know a physiotherapist, feel free to take a copy of that QR code and pass it on. They can go to my website and get further details. But if you know anyone who's physio and might not have done this, then just feel free to give them my contact details, and I'm more than happy to have a conversation. Can't do one of these without a reference list, so I've added some of the references that I've used in this presentation. Thank you, and I'm going to stop sharing.